reviewing our Christian Life and Ministry meeting workbook for the week of November 20th through 26th. This is the JW Review. So this week I'm going to try something a little bit different. I'm usually reviewing the Watchtower study articles, but quite honestly, this week's, or technically next week's articles for the meetings, they weren't all that interesting. There wasn't a whole lot there that was noteworthy. So I wanted to try something different here, and so as many of you know, Jehovah's Witnesses do go over this publication, Our Christian Life and Ministry. And to be totally honest with you, I've never really dug into this before. I've seen others review it before, but I've never really dug in. But what I did notice is that there is a lot more depth in these, because it's basically making you going back and looking at some slightly older watchtowers, and I just saw a lot more doctrinal content in these as opposed to, I guess, moral related articles. Like for example, this week's or next week's Watchtower articles was just more related to Christian living and things like that. And while those are important topics, of course, for this podcast, we're a little more interested in the doctrinal and theological issues, especially those which flatly contradict the scriptures, which we're going to see some of that today. So we're looking at the November 2017 version, and this is available at jw.org. And we're going to scroll down to the weeks that are relevant here. So we're actually not looking at this week's, which is November 13th through 19th, but we're going to look at the next week's, November 20th through 26th. And so I just have several sections here that I'm highlighting that I want to dig into. There were just some very noteworthy topics in here to dig into. So this section is treasures from God's Word. And so we're going to jump here down to this highlighted section. And the passages that are relevant here are some sections in Micah. And so what they're doing is they're drawing on topics that Micah brings up. So the first one is Micah 2:12. How was this prophecy fulfilled? So let's read Micah 2:12. It says, I will surely assemble all of you, Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together like a sheep in the fold, like a flock in the midst of its pasture. They will be noisy with men. And so let's go to the article that's in question here. It's the 2003 Watchtower from August 15th. So in that section, it's wanting you to read this paragraph, and it's directly related to Micah 2:12. It says, when was the prophecy about the collecting the remaining ones of Israel fulfilled? Its first fulfillment was in 537 BCE, when a Jewish remnant returned to their homeland from Babylonian exile. In modern times, the prophecy finds its fulfillment in the Israel of God. Since 1919, anointed Christians have been collected together like a flock in the pen, being joined by the crowd of other sheep, especially since 1935. They have become noisy with men. Together, they zealously promote true worship. So what we're really wanting to ask here is, when was Micah 2:12 fulfilled? And so what the Watchtower says is that there was a fulfillment of sorts in 537 when the Jews returned from their Babylonian captivity. They were gathered together. So what's really interesting with the Watchtower when it comes to prophecy, maybe if you're not as familiar with the Watchtower, is that they are always looking for dual or greater fulfillments. So they're very often not satisfied with an initial or one fulfillment. They usually want to look for two. And in the scriptures, that does happen. There are places where there are dual fulfillments. I mean, look at the prophecy about the virgin birth from Isaiah 7:14, I believe it is. You can find instances where there certainly are dual fulfillments. What's interesting here is that it is where the Watchtower is looking for the second fulfillment. And of course, we can always ask the question, do we have any obligation, or does anything in any biblical text mandate that we find a greater or dual fulfillment from Micah 2:12? So I think we need to consider that as well, and just not take for granted that maybe there was only one fulfillment. So why are we necessarily looking for a greater fulfillment? Excuse me. What's interesting here, too, is that instead of looking for the second fulfillment in the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh, they look for the greater fulfillment in 1919. Of all places and all times, 1919. So, some people don't really realize how important 1919 actually is. And the reason I am regularly bringing it up is because the Watchtower is regularly bringing it up. And it's a very, very crucial and pivotal date for their theology. So if that date goes away, a lot collapses, if not the whole thing collapses with their theology. Because that's basically the founding of the faithful and discreet slave. And of course, there's also other events related to that. So don't you find it interesting that in this prophecy of Micah 2:12, they say that finds its fulfillment in the date of 1919 and the years following? Because it says that since 1919, anointed Christians have been collected together like a flock in the pen. And this is especially since 1935. They have become noisy with men. And the reason they're saying that is because that's when the earthly class, or the other sheep, that whole doctrine and that understanding came about, to where you can start having Jehovah's Witnesses with an earthly hope as opposed to a heavenly hope. So that's why they're really stressing on these dates, because that's when they're saying all these Christians are coming together. But can't you just see how constructed this whole thing is? They're not getting this stuff from the Bible. They're not getting 1919 from the Bible. There is just nothing, absolutely nothing, about Christians being collected together in 1919. I mean, nothing significant happened in 1919. Regardless of what they say, because you can't find anything in the scriptures to point out any of this stuff. This just is just complete theological fabrication. So, but why not point out the first century? If we're going to find a dual fulfillment or a greater fulfillment, why not do that with the coming of Jesus Christ? It's just amazing to me that they skip that and they go straight to 1919 to find that greater fulfillment, as if there's anything in the scriptures to point that out. Of course, John 10:16, that's where it's talking about the other sheep. And of course, they think the other sheep is the great crowd or the earthly class. But John 10:16 has nothing to do with a heavenly or an earthly class. It has to do with the gathering of the Gentiles. Gathering together the Jews and the Gentiles, so they will become one flock with one shepherd. And if you want some more details on that, read Ephesians chapter 2, I believe beginning in verse 19, and you will see what John 10:16 is talking about in much greater detail. And then, of course, Revelation 7:9 is talking about the great multitude. But again, this is a complete theological fabrication with just zero justification in the text. And so we don't see any basis for Micah 2:12 referring to anything beyond the coming of Christ. So if we're going to look for dual fulfillment, we should find it in the coming of Christ, and that would continue, because this whole gathering of the remnant of Israel, that's something that happens over time as believers in Jesus Christ come about. All right, so let's jump on to the next one. Micah 7:7. Why should we show a waiting attitude for Jehovah? And this is taking us back to a 2003 Watchtower. So paragraph 20 reads, a waiting attitude brings blessing. Being aware of what should help us to display a waiting attitude like that of Micah. Experiencing Jehovah's blessing moves us to imitate Micah's spirit. He declares, I will show a waiting attitude for the God of my salvation. How do these words relate to our walking modestly with God? Having a waiting attitude or patience helps us to avoid feeling disappointed that Jehovah's day has not yet come. Frankly, we all long for the end of this wicked world. However, every week thousands of people are just beginning to walk with God. Knowing that gives us a reason for showing a waiting attitude. One longtime witness said in this connection, looking back over 55 years in the preaching work, I am convinced that I have not lost anything by waiting on Jehovah. On the contrary, I have been spared many heartaches. Have you had a similar experience? So what I want to point out here is this attitude of waiting. And Jehovah's Witnesses are just waiting anxiously for the end. They're waiting for the tribulation. They're waiting for Jehovah to come destroy this wicked system of things and just bring about paradise earth so they can live in it and be in peace and all of that. So they're talking about having a waiting attitude, being patient about that. So what I want to point out here is look at this one sentence. Having a waiting attitude or patience helps us to helps us to avoid feeling disappointed that Jehovah's day has not yet come. So if you don't know about the history of Jehovah's Witnesses, it's actually a history of disappointment, because time and time again, the Watchtower, through its leaders, has falsely predicted the end of the world and Armageddon and all these events a number of times. That has happened, and that has just led to just massive disappointment, and so many Jehovah's Witnesses leaving, and rightfully so, leaving the organization in disappointment, and you can't blame them from that. But this is saying help them to avoid feeling disappointed. But how can you say that when your whole history has been littered with disappointment? Like, can you blame, honestly, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, can you blame someone, let's say, for example, in 1975, when people were selling their homes and doing all of this preparation because they thought the end was going to come? Can you really blame them for the disappointment when the end did not come? So really, who is to blame for that? When you're telling others that you need to believe everything that the Watchtower says, can you really blame them for believing everything the Watchtower says, even if they say that the end of the world is going to come? Because if the Jehovah's Witnesses, or let's say specifically the Watchtower, predicts the end of the world in next month's Watchtower, you will be obligated to believe what it says. And if that doesn't come to pass, well, apparently you're not supposed to be disappointed, no matter how excited you were about that proposition. So let's go on to this last section. This is what has the most problems, and this is the Congregation Bible Study, where they're looking through the publication God's Kingdom Rules. So let's start out on paragraph 15. It's the gathering of anointed ones. Both Matthew and Mark, and we're going to read actually all the way through a paragraph. I think we're just going to go through paragraph 17, although they want you to read through paragraph 20. But just for the sake of time, we're not going to do that. So starting in paragraph 15, in God's Kingdom Rules, and this is actually on page 227 of that publication. You can read all of this at jw.org. A gathering of anointed ones. Both Matthew and Mark recorded Jesus' statement about the chosen ones, Spirit-anointed Christians, as part of a series of events that will occur before the outbreak of Armageddon. Speaking about himself as king, Jesus prophesies, Then he will send out the angels and will gather together his chosen ones together from the four winds, from earth's extremity to heaven's extremity. To what act of gathering is Jesus here referring? He is not speaking about the final sealing of the remnant of anointed Christians, which will occur just before the Great Tribulation begins. Instead, Jesus refers to an event that will take place during the coming Great Tribulation. Thus, apparently, at some point after the start of Satan's all-out attack on God's people, anointed ones who still remain on earth will be gathered into heaven. So the first thing I want to point out is what it actually says in Matthew 24:31. And that's what the Watchtower is saying. And this is going to happen actually. Look at the timing here. Let's just read it. Matthew 24:31. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. So let's ask ourselves, in relation to the Great Tribulation, does this happen before the Great Tribulation, during the Great Tribulation, or after the Great Tribulation? So let's just go back a couple of verses. Matthew 24:29. Let's read this up to verse 31. Ask yourself, when in relation to the tribulation does this happen? It says in verse 29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. So these events, the text explicitly says, immediately after the tribulation, these events are going to happen. But look, it says here, both Matthew and Mark recorded Jesus' statement about the chosen one, the Spirit-anointed Christians, as a part of a series of events that will occur before the outbreak of Armageddon. And then it goes on to say, Jesus refers to an event that will take place during the coming Great Tribulation. But the text says this happens after the tribulation. So you actually have a big problem with timing here. And also what's really interesting is that it says, thus apparently at some point after the start of Satan's all-out attack on God's people, anointed ones who still remain on earth will be gathered to heaven. And so what you're getting the picture of here is that let me back up a little bit. Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe the anointed class or the heavenly class will be physically or bodily resurrected. Instead, what's going to happen is they're going to be, I guess you could say, recreated as spirit creatures, and that spirit creature will be raised up into heaven. And they actually say that's resurrection, but I dispute even calling that a resurrection, though that's a whole other point altogether. But what I want to point out here is it says the anointed ones who still remain on earth will be gathered into heaven. So you'd have to know a little more about their theology to say, well, by what means are they gathered into heaven? So they're not raised bodily into heaven. So what actually happens to their body? That's really what we're asking. If they're gathered into heaven, those anointed ones are gathered into heaven once they've remained on earth, what happens to their body? Does it just fall over dead, or what actually happens? Well, let's look at this Watchtower article here. And this is going to answer this question for us. And this is directly relating to 1 Thessalonians 4:15-17, which is a text that's very problematic to the Jehovah's Witness. And this text is, and we can highlight verse 17, and I'm reading from the New World Translation in this case. Afterward, we who are living, who are surviving, So this is going back to the anointed ones who remain on the earth. Those who are surviving will together with them, that is, those who were dead in Christ and were raised up, they will be caught away in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air and will always be at home with the Lord. So the Jehovah's Witnesses believe that 1 Thessalonians 4:15 through 17 is specifically or exclusively talking about the anointed class who are gathered up with the others to meet the Lord in the air, or they believe that's referring to heaven. So here's a good question. Who are caught away in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and how does this happen? So that's the question we're asking. How do those who are remaining on earth, how are they gathered up into heaven? It says those are anointed Christians who are alive during Christ's presence in the kingdom power. They meet the Lord Jesus in the invisible heavenly realm. To experience this, though, they first need to die and be resurrected as spirit creatures. Christ's presence has already begun, so anointed Christians who die today do not remain dead. They were caught away or raised instantly. So back to this paragraph, it says that God's anointed ones who still remain on earth will be gathered into heaven, which means they have to die first. So this is at some point after the start of Satan's all-out attack on God's people. The anointed ones have to be killed and are gathered into heaven. So who kills them? That's a really interesting question. Who kills them and causes them to be raised? So if you're an anointed Christian, you're going to have to die at some point. Someone is going to have to kill you. I don't know if that's God kills you or one of Satan's attackers kills you. I just don't understand this. This is just such odd theology because there's nothing in the text of 1 Thessalonians 4:15 through 17 says that you necessarily have to die. Why can't you just be resurrected? And this is the whole problem with this idea of there not being a bodily resurrection, is that you just have to die. Whereas in biblical theology, and the clear reading in Scripture, is that you can just be raised up. You can be alive and be raised up. There's just no problem. So Jehovah's Witness theology just massively convolutes the text and makes you have these super odd and creative theological constructions just to make sense of the resurrection, because you have to have two different types of resurrections. A physical one, which is for the great crowd, the earthly class, and then a spiritual one, which can only happen to the anointed class. And you can just see how much this complicates the Bible's message. And so let's go on to paragraph 16. How does this gathering of the anointed remnant relate to the event that will occur next, Armageddon? The timing of the gathering indicates that all anointed ones will be in heaven before God's war of Armageddon begins. In heaven, the 144,000 co-rulers with Christ will receive authority to share with Jesus in wielding an iron rod of destruction against all enemies of God's kingdom. Then, together with powerful angels, the resurrected anointed ones will follow Christ, the warrior king, as he sets out to confront the vast army of enemies that is closing in on his prey, Jehovah's people. When that violent confrontation takes place, the war of Armageddon is on. So, what this is saying here, and I want to highlight, is that all of the anointed class will be in heaven before God's war of Armageddon begins. So let's actually challenge that. So let's go to Revelation 21:9. So at this time, in this timeline, there should not be any anointed Christians on earth. So let's go to and see what Revelation 21:9 says. Actually, I think this is Revelation 29. Revelation 29. And we can just back up just for a little bit of context. And it will come about to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. And here's what I want to highlight. Verse 9. And they came up on the broad plain of the earth. So this is an earthly scene, and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. And fire came down from heaven and devoured them. So the saints here, if you're reading the New World Translation, is actually the holy ones. That's the anointed class. So this text would actually read, and they, Satan's armies, came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camps of the anointed class and the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. So if you're not on earth, how can you actually be surrounded? So this is an earthly scene where the camp of the saints, or the anointed class, is surrounded. So this doesn't make any sense, because in this paragraph 16 of the Watchtower, it says all the anointed ones will be in heaven before God's war of Armageddon even begins. But Revelation 29 shows that they are on earth and being surrounded. Can you see the problem there? And also, what's interesting is that apparently the 144,000 will share with Jesus in wielding that iron destruction against the enemies of God. So it sounds like to me what they're saying is, unless I'm misreading something here, that the anointed class are going to actually go into battle with Christ to destroy God's enemies. But I don't see anything in any of these texts to show explicitly that any Christian is going to be involved in going to war and joining Jesus Christ in that war. Now, you can go to Revelation 2:26 and 27, and we can just go there real quick. It says, he who overcomes, and he who keeps my deeds until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessels of the potter are broken to pieces, as I also have received authority from my Father. So, of course, the Jehovah's Witnesses think this is referring exclusively to the anointed class, and I don't see any reason whatsoever to say anything other than the fact that this is referring to all true Christians. But I don't see anything explicitly here other than that they're being given authority and they're sharing in the ruling with Christ. I don't see anything here saying they actually go to battle and they engage in killing. I just don't see any evidence of that. And the other texts here, you can read these in New World Translation. Ezekiel 38:15 says, you will come from this place, from the remotest parts of the north, you and many peoples with them, all of them riding on horses, a great assembly, a vast army. So yeah, there is a great army, but I don't see anything explicitly where Christians are killing others in this great battle. So let's go to paragraph 17, and we'll finish up here. Execution of judgment. The war of Armageddon will be the finale of the Great Tribulation. At that point, Jesus will take on an added task. Besides being the judge of all the nations, he will also become the executioner of nations, that is, of all the people from whom he had earlier judged as goats. With a sharp, long sword, our king will strike the nations, yes, all goat-like ones, from kings to slaves. Will depart from or into everlasting cutting off. So what's really missing here in this whole picture is, where is the anointed class? And I've talked about Matthew 25:34 before. It's a very important text. So let's go there. And we can just back up a little bit. Starting in verse 32 of Matthew 25, it says, all the nations will be gathered together before him. This is everyone. Everyone will be gathered together before him. This doesn't mention any exceptions. And he will separate them from one another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. So you have sheep and you have goats. You have two groups. You're either one or the other. Where's the anointed class? Well, the text doesn't really distinguish. You're either a sheep or a goat, so the anointed class would have to be a sheep. But look at what's interesting here is it says to the sheep, inherit the kingdom. Well, I thought only the anointed class are inheritors of the kingdom? Because doesn't that mean going to heaven? Well, apparently not, because all of the sheep inherit the kingdom. So whether you're an anointed class or the earthly class, it doesn't matter. You inherit the kingdom. So the text doesn't make this distinguishment here, but of course in paragraph 17 of the Watchtower, this is only referring to the earthly class being separated from all the evil people, the goats. So if you're in a Jehovah's Witness, you really have to use scissors and you have to cut up these texts, and that's the only way to put it. Because you have to leave these important questions out, which is where the heck are the anointed class in these pictures? They're simply not there, and you've got to ask, where are they? So you can just see how much doctrinal depth we have to go into when we're looking at these simple outlines here. So what I may do in the future is do more of this, because sometimes the Watchtower study editions just don't really have a whole lot to point out in terms of disagreement. But wow, I found out in these outlines here in this publication, there is really a lot to go into. So I hope that was helpful to you, and as always, please feel free to submit your questions and your comments to me. And I look forward to what we're going to talk about next week. Thanks for watching, and thanks for listening. For more information about Jehovah's Witnesses and other topics, please visit michaeljfelker.com. There you can also reach me directly to submit questions or comments to be covered on the JW Review. To subscribe to this podcast, please go to iTunes and search for the JW Review.